We don't know what the hell is going on out there.
The Bermuda Triangle received its name as the result of the disappearance of 6 Navy planes and their crews on December 5, 1945. The first 5 planes that disappeared, apparently simultaneously, were on a routine training mission with a flight plan designed to follow a triangular flight pattern starting at the Naval Air Station at Fort Lauderdale, Florida, then 160 miles to the east, 40 miles to the north, and then back to their base, following a southwest course. Bermuda has given its name to what has been variously called the Devil's Triangle, the Triangle of Death, the Hoodoo Sea, the Graveyard of the Atlantic, and various other appellations, principally because it was noticed at the time that the apex of the triangular flight plan from Fort Lauderdale was in a direct line with Bermuda, and partly because Bermuda seems to be the northern boundary of both earlier and later disappearances of ships and planes in very unusual circumstances. But no incident before or since has been more remarkable than this total disappearance of an entire training flight, along with the giant rescue plane, a Martin Mariner with a crew of 13, which inexplicably vanished during rescue operations. Flight 19 was the designation of the group of doomed planes which left their base at Fort Lauderdale on the afternoon of December 5, 1945. They were manned by 5 officer pilots and 9 enlisted crew members. The latter detailed 2 to each plane, but on this day short 1 man, who had requested removal from flying status because of a premonition and who had not been replaced. The planes were Navy Grumman TBM-3 Avenger torpedo bombers, and each carried enough fuel to enable it to cruise over 1,000 miles. The temperature was 65 degrees, the sun was shining, there were scattered clouds, and a moderate northeast wind. Pilots who had flown earlier the same day reported ideal flying weather. Flight time was calculated as 2 hours for this specific mission. The planes started taking off at 2 p.m., and by 2:10 p.m., they were all airborne. Lieutenant Charles Taylor, with over 2,500 hours flying time, who was in command, led the planes to Chicken Shoals, north of Bimini, where they were first to make practice runs on a target Hulk. Both pilots and crews were experienced airmen, and there was no reason to expect anything of an unusual nature to happen during the routine mission of Flight 19.
But something did happen, and with a vengeance. At about 3:15 p.m., after the bombing run had been accomplished and the planes had continued east, the radio man at the Fort Lauderdale Naval Air Station tower, who had been expecting contact from the planes regarding estimated time of arrival and landing instructions, received an unusual message from the flight leader. The record shows the following. Flight leader, Lieutenant Charles Taylor. Calling tower, this is an emergency. We seem to be off course. We cannot see land. Repeat, we cannot see land. Tower, what is your position? Flight leader, we are not sure of our position. We cannot be sure just where we are. We seem to be lost. Tower, assume bearing due west. Flight leader, we don't know which way is west. Everything is wrong. Strange. We can't be sure of any direction. Even the ocean doesn't look as it should. At about 3:30, the senior flight instructor at Fort Lauderdale had picked up on his radio a message from someone calling Powers, one of the student flyers, requesting information about his compass readings, and heard Powers say, "I don't know where we are. We must have got lost after that last turn." The senior flight instructor was able to contact the Flight 19 instructor, who told him, "Both my compasses are out. I am trying to find Fort Lauderdale. I am sure I'm in the Keys, but I don't know how far down." The senior flight instructor thereupon advised him to fly north, with the sun on the port side, until he reached the Fort Lauderdale Naval Air Station. But he subsequently heard, "We have just passed over a small island. No other land in sight. an indication that the instructor's plane was not over the Keys and that the entire flight, since they were unable to see land, which would normally follow a continuation of the Keys, had lost its direction. It became increasingly difficult to hear messages from Flight 19 because of static. Apparently, Flight 19 could no longer hear messages from the tower, but the tower could hear conversations between the planes. Some of these messages referred to possible fuel shortages, fuel for only 75 miles, references to 75-mile-per-hour winds, and the unnerving observation that every gyro and magnetic compass in all the planes were off, going crazy, as it was reported at the time, each showing a different reading. During all this time, the powerful transmitter at Fort Lauderdale was unable to make any contact with the 5 planes, although the interplane communications were fairly audible.
By this time, the personnel of the base were in an understandable uproar as news spread that Flight 19 had encountered an emergency. All kinds of suppositions concerning enemy attack, although World War II had been over for several months, or even attacks by new enemies suggested themselves, and rescue craft were dispatched, notably a twin-engined Martin Mariner flying boat patrol plane with a crew of 13 from the Banana River Naval Air Station. At 4 p.m., the tower suddenly heard that Lieutenant Taylor had unexpectedly turned over command to a senior Marine pilot, Captain Stiver. Although obscured by static and strained by tension, an understandable message was received from him. "We are not sure where we are. We think we must be 225 miles northeast of base. We must have passed over Florida and we must be in the Gulf of Mexico." The flight leader then apparently decided to turn 180 degrees in the hope of flying back over Florida. But as they made the turn, the transmission began to get fainter, indicating that they had made a wrong turn and were flying east, away from the Florida coast over the open sea. Some reports claim that the last words heard from Flight 19 were, "It looks like we are," although other listeners seem to remember more, such as, "Entering Whitewater, we are completely lost." Meanwhile, the tower received a message only minutes after takeoff from Lieutenant Combe, one of the officers of the Martin Mariner, dispatched to the general area where the flight was presumed to be, that there were strong winds above 6,000 feet. This, however, was the last message received from the rescue plane. Shortly after this, all search units received an urgent message stating that 6 planes instead of 5 were now missing. The rescue plane, with a crew of 13, had disappeared as well. No further message was ever received from the Flight 19 training mission or from the Martin Mariner that was sent to rescue them.
Sometime after 7 p.m., however, the Opelika Naval Air Station in Miami received a faint message consisting of FT, FT, which was part of the call letters of the planes of Flight 19, the instructor's plane being FT-28. But if this message was really from the lost patrol, the time period in which it was received would indicate that the message was sent 2 hours after the planes had presumably run out of fuel. The original air search, initiated on the day of disappearance, was suspended because of darkness, although Coast Guard vessels continued to look for survivors during the night. The next day, Thursday, an enormous search effort was started at first light, i.e., daybreak. But in spite of one of history's most intensive searches involving 240 planes and 67 additional planes from the aircraft carrier Solomons, 4 destroyers, several submarines, 18 Coast Guard vessels, and search and rescue cutters, hundreds of private planes, yachts, and boats, and additional PBMs from the Banana River Naval Air Station and help by RAF and Royal Navy units in the Bahamas, nothing was found. A daily average of 167 flights, flying about 300 feet above the water from dawn to dusk, a minute inspection of 380,000 square miles of land and sea, including the Atlantic, Caribbean, parts of the Gulf of Mexico, and the Florida mainland and neighboring islands, with air search time totaling 4,100 hours, revealed no life rafts, no wreckage, and no oil slicks.
The beaches of Florida and the Bahamas were checked daily for a period of several weeks for identifiable flotsam from the lost planes, but without success. All possible leads were investigated. A report that a red flare over land had been seen by a commercial plane on the day of the disappearances was first thought to be the possible explosion of the Martin Mariner, but later denied. Still later, a merchant ship reported an explosion in the sky at 7:30 p.m. But if this explosion concerned the 5 Avengers, it would mean that they were still flying hours after their fuel reserves had been exhausted. Furthermore, to explain in this way the loss without trace of all planes would imply that they crashed together and exploded all at once after having maintained radio silence since the time contact was interrupted. It is further remarkable that no SOS messages were received from Flight 19 or the rescue mission. As far as making forced landings in the sea, the Avengers were capable of making smooth water landings, and in any event could stay afloat for 90 seconds, with their crews trained to abandon ship in 60 seconds. Life rafts were available and were obtained from outside the planes. Therefore, in almost any kind of forced landing, the life rafts would float and would eventually be found.
During the early part of the rescue effort, some searchers noted large swells in the sea, but the waves were so far apart that the planes could have landed, if necessary, in the troughs between them. The curious reference to whitewater in the last message received from Flight 19 may have had some connection with the thick and confusing white haze, which is an occasional feature of the area. This might explain the lack of visual sighting and the report that the sun doesn't look right, but this should not have affected the compasses and gyroscopes. In addition, there is a known radio dead spot between Florida and the Bahamas, but the plane's trouble started before radio contact was lost. A Naval Board of Inquiry, after examining all available evidence and incidentally debating the court-martial of the instrument officer, who was later exonerated when it was established that all his instruments had checked out before takeoff, ended up as much in the dark as ever as to what had really happened. Part of the report states, a radio message intercepted indicated that the planes were lost and that they were experiencing malfunctioning of their compasses. Captain W.C. Wingard, an information officer, was somewhat more direct in a subsequent press interview. Members of the Board of Inquiry were not able to make even a good guess as to what happened. Another board member rather dramatically commented, "They vanished as completely as if they had flown to Mars," thereby introducing the intriguing elements of space travel and possible UFOs, which have since become very much a part of the Bermuda Triangle legend. Serious investigators and oceanographers have offered a variety of opinions as to how these and so many other ships and planes could disappear without trace, and how so many pilots and passengers could completely vanish. Lieutenant Commander R.H. Wershing, a training officer at the Fort Lauderdale Naval Air Base at the time of the incident, who has considered the case for many years, thinks that the word disappear is an important factor concerning the fate of the crew of Flight 19, as no proof has ever been adduced that they effectively perished. A mother of one of the lost pilots who attended the naval hearing stated at the time that she had received the impression that her son was still alive somewhere in space. And Dr. Manson Valentine, a scientist who has watched the area for many years from Miami, was quoted in the Miami News as saying, "They are still here, but in a different dimension of a magnetic phenomenon that could have been set up by a UFO." A Coast Guard officer, a member of the Board of Inquiry, expressed himself with rather refreshing frankness as he observed simply, "We don't know what the hell is going on out there." And a final, more formal statement from another officer of the board expressed the consensus of the investigating officers. This unprecedented peacetime loss seems to be a total mystery, the strangest ever investigated in the annals of naval aviation. There are often elements of incredible coincidence connected with disasters, especially when they take place at sea. When the freighter Stockholm collided with the passenger ship Andrea Doria, a young girl who spoke only Spanish was snatched from her cabin on the Andrea Doria by the prow of the Stockholm and telescoped with part of her cabin into the bulkhead of the Stockholm next to the cabin of a seaman who was the only person on his ship who could speak Spanish. And the loss of Flight 19 was no exception to this element of coincidence.
Commander R.H. Wershing, then a lieutenant on duty as a training officer at the Fort Lauderdale base, and from whose first-hand notes much of the above material has been coordinated, remembers that there also had been a morning training flight on the same day that was somewhat unusual. This previous flight, which, being considerably less sensational, has been generally neglected in the press reports of the disaster, also experienced compass malfunction, and instead of returning to base, landed 50 miles to the north. A presentiment of disaster seemed to have affected at least 2 members of Flight 19. One was the flight instructor himself. At 1:15 p.m., he arrived late at the pre-flight briefing and requested of the duty officer that he be relieved from this particular assignment. His request was not accompanied by any explanation whatever. He simply stated that he did not wish to take part in the mission. As no relief was available, however, his request was denied. A second case that Lieutenant Wershing personally witnessed was the much commented on incident whereby a Marine Corporal, Alan Kosnar, scheduled to fly Flight 19, did not report to the flight line. He has been quoted in the press as saying, "I can't explain why, but for some strange reason I decided not to go on the flight that day." According to Lieutenant Wershing, however, the corporal, a veteran of Guadalcanal, had only 4 months to serve before being discharged and had requested several months previously to be relieved from flight status. On the day of the flight, the matter had come up again, and Lieutenant Wershing had told him to report to the flight surgeon to request his removal from flight duty. He did this, and the flight subsequently took off with 1 member short. When the first indications of trouble with Flight 19 became evident, Lieutenant Wershing went to the enlisted men's barracks for volunteers. The first person he met there was the recently grounded corporal, who said, "Remember, you told me to see the flight surgeon. I did, and he relieved me of flight orders. That is my flight that is lost." A report from the flight line, however, indicated that the planes had gone out with full complements, as if someone else had climbed aboard at the last minute. This caused hourly musters at the station in order to find out if anyone else was missing. When it was ascertained that no further personnel were unaccounted for, the additional mystery of the full complement report became just one more unsolvable element in the multiple disappearances. Still another unusual element in the mystery of Flight 19 became public 29 years after the incident, when Art Ford, reporter, author, and lecturer who has followed the case since 1945, made a startling revelation over a national TV program in 1974, indicating that Lieutenant Taylor had said, over his radio, "Don't come after me. They look like they are from outer space." Ford states that this original information was given to him at the time of the happening by a ham radio operator, but that he did not give much credence to it, considering the difficulties of an amateur operator receiving communications from moving aircraft, and also the excitement and rumors prevalent at the time of the incident. But Ford, later in his investigations, received some unusual corroboration in a transcript of the plane-to-tower messages included in a subsequent report brought on by pressure from parents of the missing personnel. The official and formerly secret transcript, which Ford states he was permitted to examine in part only, contained at least one phrase, "Don't come after me," in common with that supplied to Ford by the civilian shortwave radio operator, and significantly never previously released. This final mystery, with its suggestion of otherworld interference, is echoed in more than a few of the other disappearances. While scores of ships and pleasure craft have disappeared in the area of the Bermuda Triangle before and since this incident, it is noteworthy that the disasters which jointly befell the Avengers and the Martin Mariner were the first occasion in which planes were affected, and where there were so many efficient air, sea, land units to conduct such an extensive and thorough, although fruitless, search. This incident would would cause intensified search efforts in the case of plane disappearances yet to come, not only with the aim of rescuing the survivors, but also, after probable survival time had run out, to find out what had happened to them. After the incident of Flight 19, unexplained disappearances of commercial, private, and military aircraft seemed to occur with distressing regularity, in addition to the normal vanishing of large and small ships, which had gone on for scores of years before. Now, however, with air-sea rescue teams, radio communications with base, more sophisticated instruments, and more highly developed search patterns, each disappearance has been investigated with considerably more thoroughness. On July 3, 1947, a U.S. Army C-54, carrying a crew of 6 and flying on a routine flight from Bermuda to Morrison Army Airfield, Palm Beach, disappeared somewhere between Bermuda and Palm Beach, its last position being about 100 miles off Bermuda. An immediate, intensive air-sea search by Army, Navy, and Coast Guard units covered over 100,000 square miles of sea, although, except for some seat cushions and an oxygen bottle not identified as equipment from the lost plane, no wreckage or oil slick was sighted. As further disappearances occurred, a somewhat alarming coincidental feature was noted in that the majority of the incidents within the Triangle area seemed to take place within the peak tourist and hotel season, from November through February. Even more startling was the realization that many of the losses have occurred within a few weeks before or after Christmas. A British South American Tudor 4 four-motor passenger plane, a converted Lancaster bomber called the Star Tiger, flying from the Azores to Bermuda, disappeared on January 29, 1948. It carried a crew of 6 and 25 passengers, including Sir Arthur Cunningham, a British World War II Air Marshal and former commander of the 2nd Tactical Air Force of the RAF. The Star Tiger was scheduled to land at Kindley Field, Bermuda, and at 10:30 p.m., shortly before ETA, the pilot radioed the control tower a message including the words "Weather and performance excellent" and "Expect to arrive on schedule." The plane's position was reported as 380 miles northeast of Bermuda. There was no further message, but the Star Tiger never arrived. No SOS or emergency message was received or any indication that the aircraft was not functioning perfectly under optimum conditions. By midnight, the Star Tiger was listed as overdue, and by the 30th of January, the following day, a massive rescue and search operation was underway. 30 planes and 10 ships combed the area for several days without success. Some boxes and some empty oil drums were sighted northwest of Bermuda on January 31. However, if these belonged to the Star Tiger, it would mean that it was flying hundreds of miles off course when whatever hit it occurred. And it must be remembered, the pilot had announced nothing unusual concerning his course or the plane's operation during his last contact with the tower.
As the search continued, without success, numerous ham radio operators along the Atlantic coast and even further inland picked up a garbled message with the words spelled out by numbered dots, as if someone was working the sender but did not know the Morse code. The dots spelled out Tiger. Even more weird was a report from a Coast Guard station in Newfoundland. As the taps stopped, someone had apparently sent a verbal message, simply pronouncing the following letters, GAHNP. These were the call letters of the lost Star Tiger. It was presumed that these various messages were hoaxes, especially considering the known erratic and lunatic behavior of certain individuals who follow and enjoy disasters. However, a disquieting similarity to the case of Flight 19 suggests itself when one remembers the faint, fading message received at Miami, hours after the disappearance of the flight, which contained the flight's call letters, almost as if a final message was being sent or relayed from a far greater distance, in space or time, than would be indicated by the location where the planes had vanished. A court of inquiry, under the direction of Lord Macmillan, for the investigation of the loss of the Star Tiger, was appointed by the British Minister of Civil Aviation. Its report was published 8 months after the plane's disappearance.
Its findings stated that there appeared to be no grounds for supposing that the Star Tiger had fallen into the sea because of radio or mechanical failure, fuel exhaustion, failure to find destination, meteorological hazards, or errors of altimetry, to name a few possibilities. The design and manufacture of the Tudor IV were found to be such that there were no grounds, in the words of the report, for supposing that in the design of the Tudor IV airplane, or in the manufacture of the particular Tudor IV airplane, the Star Tiger, there were technical errors or omissions, judged against a standard of agreed good practice. The final opinion of the court could be considered equally applicable to other aircraft disappearances in the Triangle, both before and since the Star Tiger. It may be truly said that no more baffling problem has ever been presented for investigation. In the complete absence of any reliable evidence as to either the nature or the cause of the disaster to Star Tiger, the court has not been able to do more than suggest possibilities, none of which reaches even the level of probability. Into all activities which involve the cooperation of man and machine, two elements enter of very diverse character. There is the incalculable element of the human equation, dependent upon imperfectly known factors. And there is the mechanical element, subject to quite different laws. A breakdown may occur in either separately or in both in conjunction, or some external cause may overwhelm both man and machine. What happened in this case will never be known. By an extraordinary and rather disquieting coincidence occurring within 12 days before the first anniversary of the disappearance of the Star Tiger, her sister ship, the Star Ariel, was disappearing in a flight between Bermuda and Jamaica on January 17, 1949. Her complete course was to have been from London to Santiago, Chile, and the stop at Bermuda was for the purpose of taking on enough fuel for an additional 10 hours of flying time. When the Star Ariel left Bermuda at 7:45 a.m., the sea was calm and weather conditions were good. Her captain sent the following routine flight report back to Bermuda about 55 minutes after takeoff. This is Captain McPhee aboard the Ariel en route to Kingston, Jamaica from Bermuda. We have reached cruising altitude. Fair weather. Expected time of arrival Kingston as scheduled. I am changing radio frequency to pick up Kingston. But there were no further messages from the Star Ariel, then or ever. When the search for the Star Ariel began, there was a U.S. Navy task force on maneuvers in the same general area. 2 aircraft carriers sent their planes to join Coast Guard and Air Force rescue units sent from many points along the Atlantic coast, as well as British planes sent from Bermuda and Jamaica. Cruisers, destroyers, and the U.S. battleship Missouri joined the surface search along with British naval vessels and merchant ships that happened to be in the area. A radiogram to all ships at sea in the general area read as follows: British South American Airways 4-engine aircraft Star Ariel, GOGRE, which departed Bermuda 12:42 GMT, 17th January for Jamaica on track 216 degrees, was last heard from when approximately 15 miles south of Bermuda at 13:37 GMT, 17th January. All vessels are requested to report to the station the sighting of any floating debris in the nature of aircraft cabin upholstery and pillows, color blue, aircraft dinghies, color yellow, Mae West's color dark brown, which would all be marked BSAA, or any floating clothing.
72 search planes flying in close formation, at times almost wingtip to wingtip, covered 150,000 square miles of ocean, starting in the vicinity of the last radio report and proceeding southwest toward Jamaica. They were unable to discover a single piece of evidence which could be identified with the missing plane. Reports of a strange light on the sea came on January 18 from both a British and a U.S. plane, but search and rescue units dispatched to the vicinity found nothing, and the Air Force suspended search operations on January 22. The fact that these two British passenger planes, both belonging to the same company, British South American Airways, were lost almost within a year of each other and in the same area gave rise to suspicions of sabotage, although in later days, skyjacking would have immediately suggested itself. This possibility, as well as pilot and crew training, instrument functioning, and weather conditions, were investigated by a board of inquiry, the Brabazon Committee, which found nothing unfavorable and no clues whatever. Quote, "Lack of evidence due to no wreckage having been found, the cause of the accident to the Star Ariel is unknown." End quote. One theory considered at the time was that methyl bromide from the extinguishers had accidentally penetrated and circulated within the pressure system, causing an explosion. This would be a possibility for a freak accident in one plane perhaps, but hardly in the many others that have vanished in the same area. One of the reasons that the search for the Star Ariel had been so massive was that another passenger plane, a chartered DC-3 en route from San Juan to Miami, had, in the early morning of December 28, 1948, disappeared into the void with 36 passengers and crew. The fruitless search for this plane, involving over 40 military planes and numerous ships, covering over 300,000 miles of ocean and coastline, had been suspended only 1 week before the Star Ariel vanished. The circumstances attending the DC-3 disappearance had been even more surprising than those of the other lost flights. As with the others, the weather was excellent and the night was clear. The plane took off at 10:30 p.m. December 27th. Sometime during the night flight, the plane's captain, Robert Lindquist, had observed on the radio, "What do you know? We are all singing Christmas carols." We are reminded of the coincidental timing of the majority of the disappearing planes. Another message from the DC-3 was received by the Miami Tower at 4:13 a.m. It was, "We are approaching the field. Only 50 miles out to the south. We can see the lights of Miami now. All's well. We'll stand by for landing instructions." Nothing was ever heard from the plane again, and a land and sea search produced no identifiable wreckage. Naturally, there were no survivors or any indication as to what had happened to the passengers and crew. Since the captain had given the position of the plane as only 50 miles south of Miami, it is all the more remarkable that there was no explosion, no flare, no SOS or Mayday over the air. Moreover, the spot where the plane vanished was over the Florida Keys, where the clear waters, only 20 feet deep, would aid location and identification of the aircraft. This was to be one of several instances where a plane and passengers would dematerialize almost within the reach of a landing field, or that a ship, as we shall see in the next chapter, would vanish in sight of its home port. Large aircraft which have disappeared since the Star Ariel have generally followed the same pattern, that is, normal flight procedure, then nothing, and subsequently no trace of wreckage, oil slicks, floating debris, crew, or even suspicious concentrations of sharks. Smaller planes also have continually disappeared. No fewer than 9 of them vanished off the coast of Florida in December 1949, a sufficient number to cause one to reflect that there was something dangerous about the area, even if the pattern of disappearances had not been fairly obvious. Planes continued to disappear during the 50s. In March 1950, a U.S. Globemaster disappeared on the northern end of the triangle while on its way to Ireland. On February 2, 1952, a British York transport carrying 33 passengers and crew vanished on the northern edge of the triangle while on its way to Jamaica. Some weak SOS signals were received, but were almost immediately aborted. On October 30th, 1954, a U.S. Navy Constellation disappeared with 42 passengers and crew while flying in fair weather from Packenton River Naval Air Station, Maryland, to the Azores. More than 200 planes and many surface vessels joined in searching several hundred square miles of ocean, but found nothing. As in the case of some of the other planes, a scarcely identifiable SOS was at one point received shortly after the plane's disappearance.
On April 5, 1956, a B-25, converted to a civilian cargo-carrying plane, disappeared with 3 aboard in the vicinity of the tongue of the ocean, a mile-deep underwater canyon to the east of Andros Island in the Bahamas. A U.S. Navy Martin Marlin P-5M patrol seaplane vanished while on patrol in Bermuda on November 9, 1956, with a crew of 10. A U.S. Air Force KB-50 tanker leaving from Langley Air Force Base, Virginia, on its way to the Azores on January 8, 1962, disappeared, as had the Super Constellation, lost in 1954. Again, as with the Super Constellation, there was a weak radio message indicating an unspecified difficulty, and then silence. And following the pattern, no wreckage or any indication as to what had happened. In each case, it must be remembered that the crews had ample life-saving equipment in case of ditching, so that whatever happened to the planes happened unexpectedly and extremely quickly. An incident somewhat reminiscent of the confusion recorded by the pilots of Flight 19 occurred in the case of an SOS from a private plane proceeding to Nassau, Bahamas, but flying in the vicinity of Great Abaco Island. Although the morning weather was excellent, the pilot seemed to be flying through fog and was unable to give his position or even see the islands below him, in spite of clear visibility apparent to other observers in the surrounding area. In this case, the plane did not completely vanish, as a part of one wing was later found floating in the sea. A 2-plane loss that occurred on August 28, 1963, was first thought to be a disappearance, but later, when some wreckage was identified, the mystery only deepened. 2 KC-135 4-engine jet stratotankers, the first jets lost in the Triangle, on a refueling mission out of Homestead Air Force Base, Florida, disappeared shortly after giving their position as 300 miles southwest of Bermuda. An intensive search located probable debris from the lost planes about 260 miles southwest of Bermuda, and investigators concluded that there had been a collision between the 2 planes. Several days later, however, more debris, thought to come from the other plane, was found 160 miles away. If they had collided in the air, despite an official Air Force statement that they were not flying close together, then something must have separated the wreckage much more quickly than the ocean currents could have done. And if they had both crashed simultaneously, perhaps as the 5 Avengers had, what would have caused their instruments or engines to malfunction at the same time?
In the following month, on September 22, a C-132 cargo master disappeared between Delaware and its destination in the Azores. The last message from the pilot indicated that all was well, as he gave his position as about 80 miles off the South Jersey coast. An intensive search by planes, Coast Guard, and Navy vessels continued until September 25, but found nothing that could be identified with the missing plane. On June 5, 1965, a C-119 flying boxcar on a routine mission and carrying a crew of 10 vanished while on a flight from Homestead Air Force Base to Grand Turk Island near the Bahamas. The last call received from the C-119 gave its position as being about 100 miles from its destination, with ETA of about 1 hour. This was the last message, and after a search lasting 5 days and nights, the Coast Guard reported results negative, with the familiar comment, "There are no conjectures." As in the case of Flight 19,
the Avengers, and other vanishing planes, faint and unintelligible messages were picked up and soon faded out as if something were blocking radio transmission, or else that the plane was receding, as has been suggested, farther and farther into space and time. It is worthy of note that another plane flying the same route but in the opposite direction as the lost C-119 reported that the weather was clear and the visibility good. Within the period 1945 to 1965, 15 commercial airliners disappeared in this area, as well as a great many military and civilian planes. The phenomenon has not given any noticeable signs of abating. Some rather unusual circumstances accompanied the disappearance of Carolyn Cassio, a licensed pilot who, flying a light plane, vanished with one passenger on June 7, 1964, on a flight from Nassau to Grand Turk Island, Bahamas. When she got to the point where she calculated Grand Turk should be, she radioed that she could not find her direction and that she was circling over 2 unidentified islands, adding, "Nothing is down there," and later, "Is there any way out of this?" Strangely enough, observers on Grand Turk at that time noted that a light plane circled the island for about half an hour before disappearing. But how was it, if observers could clearly see the plane, that the pilot could not see the buildings on Grand Turk? A Chase YC-122, carrying 4 persons en route to Grand Bahama from Palm Beach, Florida, vanished at some point northwest of Bimini on January 11, 1967. A recent loss on the comparatively short run from Fort Lauderdale to Freeport took place on June 1, 1973, when Reno Rigoni disappeared with his co-pilot Bob Corner in a Cessna 180. No wreckage was found anywhere in the vicinity of his indicated flight pattern in a search which included the Everglades. No distress signal was heard from their radio. As this book goes to press, still another unusual disappearance has taken place 900 miles southwest of the Azores, a point marking the last sighting, February 17, 1974, of Thomas Gatch, an aspirant transatlantic balloonist. A 223,000 square mile area was searched by United States Navy planes, but with no result. While the vastness of the ocean and inconstancy of the winds would suffice to explain the swallowing up of the balloon by the sea, the area of the disappearance is, in itself, intriguing. While special reasons and suggestions have been advanced in the case of each unexplained disappearance, phrases reoccur in official reports as well as in books and articles describing the losses. The phrases include CAT, as in Captain A.T., and clear air turbulence, wind shear, atmospheric aberrations, magnetic anomalies, and electromagnetic disturbances, which would explain some of the plane losses. They would by no means explain the plane's disappearances or the many ships which have been lost in the same area. While the Navy and Coast Guard recognize a compass variation, as well as a radio dead spot within a section of the area, the official policy is still clearly expressed in the words of Captain S.W. Humphrey. It is not felt that an atmospheric aberration exists in this area, nor that one has existed in the past. Fleet aircraft and patrol flights are conducted regularly in this same area without incident.
Nevertheless, the incidence of disappearances in the lower section of the Bermuda Triangle, especially the Bahamas, the Florida East Coast, and the Florida Keys, has been well described by the late Ivan Sanderson, who investigated this area as well as numerous other areas of ship and plane disappearances over a period of many years. The number of disappearances is out of all proportion to such recorded losses anywhere else. A pertinent observation is made by Dale Tytler in his Wings of Mystery, when he considers that by now a considerable fleet of planes has disappeared without trace within this small area. All these planes were flown by experienced airmen and directed by trained navigators.
All carried radio and survival equipment, and all disappeared in good weather. He adds the intriguing observation that almost all of the planes disappeared in the daytime. Robert Burgess, another researcher and writer about phenomena of the seas, concludes in his book Sinkings, Salvages, and Shipwrecks, there is reason to believe that a factor far greater than chance may be involved in these mysterious accidents. He adds that whatever it is called, whether an atmospheric aberration or something else, it strikes without warning frequently enough to be alarming. As we have mentioned before, there is considerable doubt as to the boundaries of the Bermuda Triangle, as well as whether it exists at all. We have heard it described as an actual triangle, of which the northern apex is Bermuda, a great lozenge-shaped area in the western part of the North Atlantic, an area following the continental shelf of the southern United States and the Gulf of Mexico and the Antilles, or an elastic danger area extending from the Bahamas to Florida and through Florida to the Gulf of Mexico. Whatever its exact shape, this area has given rise to an entire folklore of disappearance, whether the object is a plane, ship, yacht, sailboat, submarine, or vanishing personnel from abandoned ships. The attribution of mysterious powers to the Bermuda Triangle has become so widespread that any disappearance or mysterious accident elicits comments on and review of many of the other unsolved mysteries. Comment on TV or radio usually brings forth questions from understandably concerned listeners who have been considering visiting the area by plane. Such nervous inquiries are usually answered with the assurance that there is no danger to such travel inasmuch as innumerable crossings of the triangle have been and are being made without incident. Some travel agents are sometimes hesitantly asked by passengers en route to points beyond the triangle, "Do you fly through the Bermuda Triangle?" A question fairly easy to answer in the negative since the triangle's boundaries are somewhat fluid. On one recorded occasion, an excuse was given to a restless passenger explaining the plane's delay. We had to fly around the Bermuda Triangle. A further reassurance is the fact that today's aircraft have many more safety devices than some of those that have disappeared in the past. Some of these devices were not in use at the time of some of the more striking incidents. These included transistors, decahefix, LORAN, which was, however, in use on the Star Ariel, and the fact that even small planes now use Omni, a radio-directed homing system that enables planes to find their way back to base through the thickest clouds. Nevertheless, despite all modern improvements, odd incidents and losses continue to occur within the triangle and adjacent coastal lands. Within the past year, several planes mysteriously disintegrated over land within a short distance of the Miami airport, including Eastern Airlines Flight 401, a Lockheed L-1011, with a loss of over 100 passengers and crew on December 29, 1972. Examination of the conditions of the loss of Flight 401 may shed light on many of the flights that have disappeared suddenly over water. Dr. Manson Valentine observes, "Analyzing all available data, it is apparent that in the last 7 or 8 seconds of flight, the plane descended at such a rapid rate that neither flight control at Miami nor the pilots had time to check it out. All altimeters were working so that the pilots would, under normal circumstances, have had ample correctional time. So fast was this descent, not alluded to anywhere in reports as being unusual, that Miami Control had only one sweep of the radar, 40 seconds in all, to notice it. On the second sweep, the plane had descended from 900 feet, where it was first recognized as out of the 2,000-foot prescribed path, to less than 300 feet. Probably it had already crashed. This fall rate cannot be accounted for by loss of autopilot, stall characteristics, pilot inexperience, or even the half-power position of throttles. There must have been an atmospheric reason, quite probably magnetic anomaly of some sort. When planes and boats mysteriously disappear, or in the case of a plane, disintegrate in this area, an increasing number of people feel a lingering doubt as to whether they have been lost normally, that is, through unusual weather conditions, pilot fatigue or error, control faults, structural or engine failure, etc. Or whether the force that often seems to snatch planes out of the sky and ships from the surface of the sea is still in operation. John Godwin, in This Baffling World, in commenting on public acceptance of such a possibility, notes that American and British authorities have never officially proclaimed the Triangle area to be a danger zone, and adds that, but privately, both marine and aviation experts have confessed that they may be facing a phenomenon of environment rather than a chain of technical mishaps.
He observes that whatever is happening may be as unknown to people of the present day as the power of radium was to alchemists of the 15th century. He further points out that, although one cannot be sure that there is a connection between the vanishing ships and planes, all these craft were crowded into the same narrow geographical confines. Long before the aircraft incidents of the 1940s and thereafter, the area of the sea encompassed in the Bermuda Triangle, including Cape Hatteras, the coasts of the Carolinas, and the Florida Strait, had often been referred to as the ship's graveyard, the sinkings usually being caused by heavy seas and sudden storms. The Sargasso Sea is also referred to as the ship's graveyard or the Sea of Lost Ships for an opposite reason, that ships have been lost there not from storms but from calms. Within this general area, certain mysterious disappearances of large ships without the sending of SOS signals or the subsequent findings of flotsam or bodies had already been noted through the years. But it was not until the mass plane disappearances of 1945 and thereafter, and the sudden disappearances of large and small boats, that researchers began to consider the recurrent pattern of disappearances. A headline in the Manchester Guardian, appearing at the time of the Flight 19 disappearance, is typical of this reaction. It reads, "Sargasso Graveyard now claims planes as well as ships." The disappearing planes brought the Bermuda Triangle worldwide attention. But for more than 170 years, and perhaps before records were available, ships large and small have been disappearing with their crews, and crews have also been vanishing from their ships within the Bermuda Triangle. Some of the incidents connected with these marine disasters possess features strongly reminiscent of the mysterious losses by air, while others present unusual and surprising peculiarities.